Welcome back to the second part of protection of SharePoint 2010 using DPM 2012 or DPM 2012 SP1. In the first part of this, we covered basic configuration, setting up SharePoint protection, some of the caveats and things to look for in verifying that you have full protection of your farm, including service applications and search providers and whatnot, because those two take a little bit of extra time and effort to be able to get those protected. In this session, we're going to talk about remote blob storage. We'll also briefly touch on restores, what the restore process looks like, as well as the catalog process to determine what it is and then how you can kick that off manually. This one will have very few demos. There's not a lot to demo to some of these things, but we will have a couple just to look at the process. To start out, we're going to look at remote blob storage. This one we do not have a demo for. It's we're just covering this to cover what is protected or what we can protect, what's supported and what's not. Initially, what we'll talk about is some of the terminology so that we're familiar with what the remote blob storage is. First off, you've got your blob, which is a binary large object. This is basically an unstructured item that is put into a SQL database. So you could pick like a JPEG or a Word doc, something like that, that is then stored in a SQL database. RBS specifically is the remote blob storage. So this is basically the industry standard terminology that's used when we talk about how we're storing those blobs. You know, how exactly are those going to be housed within your SQL? Because there's a lot of different ways to do that enhances the functionality that allows SQL to function better, depending on how you set that up. File stream is the Microsoft SQL Server specific implementation of remote blob storage. And then finally, the blob store itself, that's the actual final location where that blob gets stored. So it could be, you know, NTFS device or something like that inside a database, whatever. But the blob store is the actual final resting place, for lack of a better term. Now, the only thing that we're really going to cover now that we have a decent understanding of what remote blob storage is, or RBS is we're going to cover what we can support. Now, this is specific to protecting a SharePoint farm using Data Protection Manager 2012 or 2012 SP1 that is using a SQL backend that's using RBS. So this is not DPM specific to RBS. It's specific to DPM protecting SharePoint that's using RBS. So what is supported is it has to be a local file stream. Pretty short list. So in other words, we need the blob store to be local to the application database. Now this is all very specific to SQL. But this is the terminology we need. If you have a DBA that's setting up your backend for your SharePoint farm, this is the information that you need to tell them, is that it needs to be a local file stream. What's not supported is any remote file streams. So if you have your application database on one SQL server and your blob store database split up on a different SQL server, then we're not going to be able to protect that SharePoint farm using DPM. Or if it's a remote file stream where the SQL server has the application database and then a separate blob store database, then again, we're not going to be able to get that. We also do not support any third-party RBS solutions, so it does need to be the Microsoft SQL Server file stream RBS solution in order for us to be able to communicate with it and protect it. And finally, file streams that are stored on a share. So if they put it out and created a file share, put their blob storage on that share, then again, we're not going to be able to communicate. And this usually comes down to the ability of all the writers to communicate with each other and determine where the data is. So these are limitations on being able to protect a remote blob storage. The cataloging process in SharePoint, we catalog, and a lot of people have some confusion about what the cataloging is. So first off, I want to talk about the purpose. The purpose of the catalog is that after we back up your databases, your content, now we don't really know necessarily what they are. All we know is it is a content underscore content database. And when you actually look at it from the SharePoint side, that content database isn't a content database. That is a list, that is a site, that's subsites, that's documents. All of that is consumed in that content database. So on the DPM side, if we want to be able to go in and restore a very specific Word doc or a site or anything specific like that, then we're going to actually have to be able to understand what is in those content databases and what the specific data is. And that's where the catalog comes in. So in the catalog process, we've got the content databases, but we'll go out, we'll communicate with SharePoint and say, okay, so each of these content databases, can you tell me exactly what's in them? And it goes through, communicates that, and determines what the content is, what the data is, what the structure looks like. And then when we go to do our restore and we double click on it, a specific content database, then we'll see enumerated your default lists, your sites, all of the additional information, and we'll be able to navigate in to get the specifics. And why this is important is because if you see that you're getting good backups, but the catalog process is failing, when you go to do a restore, if there's any new, we'll say a new document was uploaded to the SharePoint site, well, we got a good backup of that content database, so we have a backup that includes that content. However, you're not going to be able to navigate in and see that specific item until the catalog process runs. The default runtime for the catalog process is 3 hours after your first full backup of the day. So if you left all the defaults on by DPM will set up a backup of a SharePoint farm for 8 p.m. every day, and that's once a day. That will leave you with a catalog job which will run at 11 p.m. So that's 3 hours after the first full backup. If you've modified this and you're running at, say, 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., well, then 8 a.m. is your first full backup. Therefore, your catalog jobs are going to run at 11 a.m. So just kind of be aware that that job is tied to the specific time of your full backup, the first full backup of any of a day. If you need to change the default time when a job is run, again, it's set for 3 hours after your first full backup. There is a command, set production job start time, in the DPM PowerShell commandlet that will modify that value, and we'll go over that very quickly in just a second. Also, if you need to run an ad hoc catalog, because usually this is done with troubleshooting, but in theory it could be done if you've had a lot of important documents added and you manually create a recovery point and you want to make sure that you have a good catalog against that, so that if you need to restore, you've got the data, then you can run an ad hoc catalog using the start create catalog commandlet. And again, we'll cover both of those here next. For catalog manipulation, it's really a three-step process. First thing you want to do is get the protection group where your SharePoint farm protection is. So in this case, if I pull get protection group from my DPM server, DPM01, and put it into the variable $PG, you'll see that I've got two protection groups there. And the one I want is obviously SharePoint protection, or SharePoint 2007 farm. Then I'm going to do a get modifiable protection group. So I'll take the the value, and let me actually backtrack very quickly. I said obviously I want SharePoint 2007 form. In this case, it's actually protection group 2, which is a SharePoint 2010 form I was protecting. So let me throw that out there. Your get modifiable protection group will take the variable from the $PG and pull that into the $MPG. And you'll notice we did a 0 in brackets there because it was the first one in the list. Anytime you have a list like that, that's an array, and you have to give it a variable, and those lists will start with the number 0. Once we have that, we can do the set protection job start time for the dash protection group switch and point it to the $MPG, and then set the catalog offset at 300. 300 is in minutes, so you can set it if you want to run it sooner. After your first full backup of the day, you can set that down to 60 or 120 minutes. By default, it's going to be 180, or you can set it and push it further out if you want. For the catalog manipulation and forcing an ad hoc, first thing we want to do is get our protection group and then get our data source. So similar to the other one, we want to do the get protection group. Here we're going to deal with the protection group, the SharePoint 2007 form for this example. We're going to pull that protection group and put it into our $DS. And we'll notice that with that DS we have 2 items, which is the search and the actual SharePoint form. So the item that we're wanting to run a catalog against is the second item in the list. So we do a start create catalog against $DS with a 1 in brackets, because 1 represents the second item in the array, which again starts with the number 0. And you'll see that after you do that, you'll immediately get a SharePoint catalog in progress, has completed false, and that's all you'll ever get. It's not going to update that. There's no way to see in this UI that if anything's been updated. So with that, we will take a look real quickly at how we can verify if these jobs have been run. So we're going to look at our DPM protection. And here we have our SharePoint form. And when we look at this protection, you can see that I did leave it at default, which is 8 p.m. every day is going to run, so that we know our catalog jobs should be running at 11 p.m. every day. What you would do is go into monitoring, and you can just look at all jobs, all of today's jobs, or we can create a filter for this. And if we're most specifically looking for the catalog jobs, we would unselect all, go in and look at SharePoint catalog task, and then we would specify we just want it for our SharePoint form, so we would uncheck the C drive and click on preview, hit cancel, and then you can see that we have 1 scheduled for today, which again is at 11, 3 hours after the 8 o'clock. And we have 5 jobs that completed successfully. It is common that you will see that it's 0 meg transferred. Just as long as it's showing up as complete, then you've got what you need. All right, so for restores, the restores, there's not a whole lot to it, because again, it's a process that has worked, but what I'm going to cover is how the process has changed really from DPM 2010 to DPM 2012, and we'll walk through a restore relatively quickly because again the process is pretty simple, but there's just going to be an understanding of how that process is working behind the covers to allow you to understand what's going on and why you may see a failure and then an immediate success. So for the restore process, there's two versions of what this process looks like. There's the optimized and unoptimized. And these will only be for DPM 2012, and it's only for protection of SharePoint 2010 and forward. The process for this is that in a regular restore in SharePoint 2010 or DPM 2010 of SharePoint 2010, we have your content database, which would have, in theory, a 1 megabyte Word doc that you need to restore. And in order to restore that content database, which may be up to 10 or 20 gigs in size, because it's the entire content database for that application, but you just have that 1 meg file. So in order to restore that 1 meg file, we would have to restore that entire 20 gig content database to a staging server that had SQL on it. That staging server would use SQL, mount up that database. We would then use SharePoint APIs to extract the 1 meg Word doc out of that database, and then we would use those SharePoint APIs again to insert them back into the original content database on your original farm. So that's kind of the process that we would walk through. And that's called the unoptimized process, because it's not optimal to restore that entire content database. With DPM 2012 and 2012 SP1, we now have an optimized process. And in the optimized process, what we've switched is we back up the content databases so that as they sit on the replica volume of your DPM server, they're actually a live mountable version of that content database. So whenever you go to do that restore, instead of restoring that entire 20 gig content database over to, again, your target temporary staging server, what we're going to do is use that temporary staging server to mount. We'll share out the replica volume. We'll use your staging server over the network. We'll just do a mount of that database so that it's remotely mounted. Once that's done, we'll use, again, the SharePoint APIs to pull the data. Use the SharePoint APIs again to push it back in. So instead of waiting for that entire 20 gig restore process, which could take an hour, 2 hours, depending on the bandwidth, the size, all those variables, now within 2 minutes, we've mounted that database, pulled the data out, shoved it back into the right place. There are some restrictions to whether or not we can use optimized versus unoptimized, and I'll cover those on the next slide. If you find that you are in one of these situations where you cannot use the optimized workflow, what will happen is every time you go to do a restore, DPM will initially try to do the optimized workflow. Once it fails for whatever reason, whatever condition you're hitting, it will then turn around and try the unoptimized. If you don't want to walk through that every time and you just know that you're going to need to use the unoptimized, you can put this registry key on the DPM server, and basically it does exactly what it says, is it's going to disable the optimized workflow and force it to go through and use the unoptimized workflow on every restore. That's all what you would consider just a regular restore process using the content databases, and that's all kind of the standard what DPM has set aside. If going back to the original backup discussion, you're backing up service application search, or the identity application that's built into SharePoint, then there's additional steps you have to take, and depending on how you decided to back that up, you would then go back in and look at doing a restore. Now, the links I put here, and similar to the links I put in the original one for backing up, you just have to kind of marry how you're going to back it up with the SharePoint knowledge you have, with knowing what the service application is, and then you can come in and marry that with then how the restore is done, whether or not you're just going to restore the content, or the service application database, or if you're going to have to restore a file that you backed that service application up through the SharePoint PowerShell, and now you can restore that file and then use the SharePoint PowerShell to do a restore with that. Now, the optimized ILR restrictions that I was talking about. First off, the SQL versions must match. So if you're backing up your SharePoint form and it's using a SQL 2008 R2 backend, your temporary staging server cannot be a SQL 2005 box, because the 2005 will not be able to do a remote mount of that 2008 R2 database. There can't be any schema changes, so if there are any major updates to SharePoint from when the backup was done and to where the restore is being done, then you won't be able to use the optimized workflow because of those changes in the schema. Most notably, something like probably a service pack for SharePoint or something may cause some schema changes to take place. The SQL server that you are using for your temporary or staging SQL server cannot be using local SQL accounts, because that server, of course, is going to have to access the share and mount that database. And if SQL is using a local account, then it's not going to be able to do that, because it won't be able to access the network share. If your SharePoint farm is using the file stream databases and you're protecting it, then we're not going to be able to use the optimized ILR for that. And then finally, if you're doing long-term protection to tape and the restore point you choose is from a tape, then we're not going to be able to do that, because we can't create a share on a tape to be able to mount that. So we're going to have to actually restore that database from the tape to your temporary staging location before we can then mount it. So we won't be able to use the optimized process there either. So we'll do a quick demo. As I said, there's not a whole lot to this, but we'll kind of walk through a SharePoint item level restore. And if we look here, this is my SharePoint protection, and I have to see where I have some content. Looks like it's here. And here, of course, is the sites I have protected. And if we were going to restore this list as an example, we right-click that and click on Recover. And it's going to ask us some questions. Where in this case, since we're just restoring this item, we're going to restore it back to the original site. It is worth noting that if you're restoring a site or a list, then what we do is we'll go in and we'll merge it. For instance, if you have your entire site went down and you need to restore that, you can't delete that site and then restore on top of it. What you'll have to do is create a new dummy site and then restore back to that, because if that site doesn't exist, we won't be able to do a restore. So we are going to recover back to the original site, and we're going to do so without the use of a recovery farm. This is the temporary staging instance, which I talked about a little earlier. And I think we're just going to use our SQL Server, which I believe is 782. Now you can point it to your local DPM SQL instances. However, by default, those are set when DPM is installed. Those will be using local accounts for the SQL services. So while the restore will work, what it's going to have to do is restore the entire database again to that server, even though it's local to itself, in order to be able to mount it up. So I'm going to choose CButch 782. This temporary location is only going to be used if the optimized ILR fails. So it's going to use CButch 782 to try to remotely mount that database for me. If that remote mount fails because of one of those conditions we talked about, then it's going to turn around and it's going to copy the database to this location and use an unoptimized workflow. So that's the reason we're still asking for a location to put this at, even though hopefully we won't need it. The other thing here is, while we do list shares as an option, we can't actually leverage them because of the permissions and requirements. So you have to use a location, and you can just use any location on that volume. Most people just obviously create a temp directory for that. This is the temporary location on your web front-end server, because once we do the SharePoint API calls to extract the data from the content database, we need a location on the web front-end server to put that data so that we can then use the SharePoint API calls again to push it into the correct location. This is just a temporary staging area, so the location doesn't really matter. You can create any temp location for this. And we hit on recover. And we can go into monitoring once that's done, and look at today's jobs. It will show it's already completed a SharePoint import-export task, and now it's going to go through and do the actual SharePoint API portion of this. If for some reason the one of our conditions had been met or not been met, and we had to do the unoptimized workflow, you would see that this first SharePoint import-export task would fail. And then, of course, so would the subsequent two. And then a little bit later, you would see a disk recovery. So what that's telling you is it was not able to remotely mount that database. And in turn, it had to recover the entire content database to that staging area. So it did a disk-based recovery. And then that would immediately be followed by the two SharePoint import-export tasks. Okay, so that's really it. That's all there is to doing a restore. I strongly recommend, just like figuring out what your service applications require, that you go in and you test doing restores. They can be as simple as this, but depending on what you're restoring, where you're restoring it to, then you can start adding little complexities, little things like that. So don't rely on being in a crisis and having to figure it out then. Do it in advance, figure it out, create some dummy sites, create some dummy documents in the SharePoint form, back them up, do your catalogs, do your restores, make sure everything works the way you expect it. With that, thank you all very much for your time, and I hope that you were able to get some good information out of this, and have a good one.